Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about the tension between fantasy and mimesis, between the fictive elements and the conceits and tropes and aspects of all of that sort of thing, and the baseline verisimilitudinous recreation of a norm that we can sort of almost identify as real. So it's talking about fantasy on the one side, or fictive reality, or the made up stuff on one side. And then on the other side, we have things that have come from our world or are deployed in a way that make us believe in the reality of the novel. And between these two things, joining these two things, because obviously there's movements between them, but this tension is negotiated by suspension of disbelief. Because if you are unwilling to buy into the story, if you're unwilling to go with what you're being told, you are going to disbelieve all of it. But authors do things to help us sort of identify certain aspects that aid and support our suspension of disbelief, so that when we come to the startling things or the really strange things, we just accept them along with all of the other things. So it's always a balance between the fictive reality and the sort of the mimetic aspects. And the first distinction to make is, if a reality has dragons in it, if the dragons are silly and don't make sense, it doesn't matter that you've bought into all of the other things in that reality. If the dragons are weird and contradictory, and this is meant to be a very serious, believable is such a strange word, but if it's meant to be very straight-faced in its portrayal, and the dragons are silly and strange and don't really make any sense, it can ruin your suspension of disbelief. On the other hand, in Pratchett's Guards, the swamp dragons and the dragons there are these strange, wonderful creatures that in another setting, in another narrative, in another world, they would ruin your suspension of disbelief, but they fit the tone and style of the narrative. So it creates a cohesiveness to Discworld that, even though these weird contradictory elements, these strange elements, these absurd elements, the entirety of Discworld is like, and of course it's underlaid by some very serious and pointed social commentary. Like the Discworld series by Sir Terry Pratchett is absolutely phenomenal and everyone should read it. But in that Discworld Diageesis, in the story world, the absurdity of everything fits together. It is cohesive. Nothing really stands out as it shouldn't be there. Whereas if you took some of those elements and you plunked them down into a very serious epic fantasy world like Roshar, and you put those elements in, suddenly they would seem very out of place. They would be tonally dissonant. And because of that dissonance, it would ruin our suspension of disbelief. We would believe less in the novel, we would believe less in the story world, and quite often we would disengage from it and it becomes less interesting to read. Now, the reason I bring all of this up is I saw a tweet by someone, and I'm going to share it here, but I've hidden their name. I've hidden everything about their identity, because this is not to have a go at them. I think their tweet actually brings up this really interesting perspective of the tension that we develop between buying into aspects of a fictive reality and the necessary verisimilitudinous nature of things that has to be there to support it. But that balancing act that fuels our suspension of disbelief or supports our suspension of disbelief is always going to be personal. So I'm going to bring their tweet up. And yes, I may be slightly flippant and facetious about this tweet, but the underlying point raised by it is actually a really good point. So, fantasy authors, or historical fiction, I guess, please stop using ring mail. It wasn't a thing that was ever actually used. And the first historical record of it is from the 19th century. And it was basically just used as decoration because it kind of looks like chainmail-ish. So I cycled through a number of different responses to this. And I decided, no, that it would be terribly mean. I get what they're talking about, and I vehemently disagree. But there is a bigger point here. But I was contemplating saying, yes, we should all use chitinous armor when riding on the back of a dragon and hurling lightning, just like that armor found in the late Roman era. Or the shard plates. That's the perfect armor to use in fantasy, you know, modeled on late Iron Age weapons and armor that we found. When it is historical fiction, the fiction is trying to adhere far more closely to our base norm, our reality. And therefore, when you have anachronistic elements, when you have things that did not appear in our base level norm, reality, or history, those stand out. As soon as you start introducing fantasy elements, you are messing with that balance, because now it is no longer our base level norm. Now it is a different variant of Earth, even if it is meant to be late Iron Age and it's set in all of the same things. And they've just introduced a fantasy element into this, and it's a fantasy version of medieval Europe. Fine. But if the model is medieval Europe and they've introduced a fantasy element, it's not our medieval Europe. It is an medieval Europe, and it's distinct. It's going to follow slightly different rules and lines. And when it comes to secondary worlds, when it comes to high fantasy or epic fantasy, or worlds in which there are weird and wonderful things, presuming that the types of armor and weaponry from our world follow the same trajectory in that world is an assumption. And we know what the whole expression about when you make an assumption is. Well, it's when you assume, but because when it's just an assumption, you made an ass out of you and umption. But I get the point here. If we go back to something like the Iliad, in the Iliad, there's Bronze Age weapons and armor, and there's Iron Age weapons and armor. And if you know anything about ancient Greek history and the archaeology of it, and believe me, I know people who do know about this and they have talked my ear off about it, they can explain why these two different things shouldn't be there at the same time, because they're separated by several hundred years of technology. But me reading the Iliad, I notice things about the fact that the certain gods are there and what that says about the time in which it was written, because when we read it, we can see which gods are in primacy and how that ties into sort of Greek history and Greek politics. That's interesting, but it wasn't an interest of the certain person I was talking to. So one of the things that kind of disturbs their reading and enjoyment of it is the fact that the metallurgic military history of the technology in the Iliad is not correct. For me, that's just a signal that it was composed over multiple times, that what we have as the Iliad is actually a composition that has been reworked multiple times, probably by different authors, different poets, and this is now the version we have. It's a composite. If we are encountering a story that is meant to be in the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, and it is suddenly featuring late Iron Age technologies, that in historical fiction would be anachronistic. But if we have a setting that is loosely inspired by, the word loosely is important there, inspired is important there, say the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, and there are technologies from different periods, but there's also magic and strange creatures. How is the introduction of different so-called anachronistic elements distinct from the introduction of the magical elements? Because magical elements, just because they are identifiable as made up, does not mean that everything else in it isn't just made up. And this comes down quite often to what we personally need as individual readers to create that suspension of disbelief. Because when it comes to something like armor, there is and has been a strong movement in a lot of discussions about period accuracy to the depictions of armor. But that is only one function in a novel. This creation of verisimilitudinous norms, this base level mimetic reality, that is one function of it in the text. The other functions have to do with reader engagement, reader understanding, and also creating distinct cultures and representations and various other aspects about characterization and world building in the novel. So there's a whole slew of other reasons why certain things are done with armor. So imagine a quest group. And in this quest group, everyone was wearing period accurate brigandines that were all identical. Their lower half was covered in identical sort of skirts or kirtles of exactly the same material. Because they're all part of one unit, they're all colored exactly the same way. They all use exactly the same weapons. They all wear exactly the same style of helmet. Now, when you try to visualize that, there's nothing distinct about any of them visually. They all look exactly the same. And that would be incredibly accurate to how these things actually happened in history, that people had very similar types and styles of armor. Only the nobles and the lords and the rich people got to embroider their armor. Or if you had inherited armor, you got it, handed down to you, so it may be distinct from everyone else. But we're talking about a squad in a fantasy world or a group in a fantasy world that are all being outfitted at the same time. So it's all going to be identical. That may be sort of period accurate. It may be historically accurate. It may be verisimilitudinous. It might create a sense of authenticity. But in terms of reader engagement, wouldn't it be better if a couple of them had different styles of armor? That one wears chainmail, that one wears plate, that one is in half plate, that one is in studded leather. Regardless of how you feel about studded leather as an actual style of armor, imagine it's a brigandine where the front of it is leather and the studs coming through. That's when someone looks at it and goes, oh, that's studded leather armor. It's a brigandine. The plates are on the inside. People can't see it. Just let it go. But if they all have distinct armor types, then when you are reading, or if it's a film, when you are viewing them, you can readily identify each different character by the type of armor that they're wearing. You can color code certain things where someone always has a flash of blue, someone else always has a flash of red. One person always has a helmet with side guard, someone else has a nose guard, someone else doesn't wear a helmet, even though that's very silly. And of course they should all wear helmets, but we like to see the actors' faces in films and television. Therefore, it's nice sometimes when we can see the actors' faces. Means then that when they're doing the stunts, we recognize that they're doing them, and it adds a point of connection between us and the actor and the character. It draws us further in. So even if they are coming from different periods of time, if we use armor styles from different cultures, from different periods of time, the use of all of these different things can create very distinct characters that a reader or a viewer can readily identify. And then add in the weapons. Someone uses a rapier and someone else a kind of foil, but this is in the same period where the person next to them is using a claymore and someone else is using a gladius. And then someone else is using some sort of Zweihander axe hybrid with flames coming off it, because it's fantasy. When we think of all of these different elements, creating distinct looks, distinct accoutrement, distinct weapons and arms and armament, all of those things go to creating distinct characters, distinct characteristics, making them readily identifiable. And sometimes that can mean a sacrifice to a presumed historical fidelity. Because when we think about it, fantasy worlds are not ever beholden to historical fidelity. They are not beholden to historical reality. That's why they're fantasy. But this person made a good point. When something is introduced that we think is silly, or that we can identify going, that's wrong, that doesn't fit, it throws us out of the narrative. But the issue is banded armor or ringed armor or chainmail or whatever type, unless you've studied that, you're not going to understand the history of the technologies that were used to produce them, how they were made, how that feeds into the actual economy of how they were produced, how expensive they were, what actually went on with them. If you don't understand the history of weaponry, you might not pick up on someone using technology from 200 AD and someone else using technology from 1400 AD, a 1,200 year gap in the styles of technology, and yet they're sitting side by side in a fantasy world, and we don't blink an eye because it's sword, it's armor, that's it. The actual style of armor is almost irrelevant to the vast majority of readers. So I hope you can understand from this, while I think getting bent out of shape about someone using a style of armor that wasn't used in this world, or using a style of weapon that was a show weapon, the idea of dual wielding two long swords, like how often have we seen that in fantasy and even in science fiction and in gaming, dual wielding two swords. And we do have historical records, people did use two swords, but it's not the most efficient way to do things. It was probably only used for showmanship and these competitions to demonstrate how good they were, that they could use these two long weapons together. But it still doesn't stop it looking cool in fantasy. So I understand the point. I can understand why certain things will trip people up. But the idea that fantasy should be historically accurate and only use things that are historically accurate is ridiculous and has no basis in either the construction of narrative or in the construction of fiction or in anything. It's a silly point, but it does go to the individual elements that we all have that affect our own personal suspension of disbelief. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you do know who made that tweet, don't mention it. I've only brought it up because I thought it was a good talking point. They're perfectly entitled to their opinion. So see you in the next one.